On October 13, 1972, a plane carrying 45 people crashed into a mountain range so remote that rescue teams eventually gave up looking for it. Search efforts were called off after just over a week. As far as the outside world was concerned, everyone on board was dead. They weren't. For 72 days, a group of survivors stayed alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth, with no food, no proper shelter, and temperatures that dropped to nearly 30 degrees below zero at night. And what they had to do to survive became one of the most debated, and eventually one of the most respected, stories of human endurance in modern history. This is the story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, and it's a lot more complicated and honestly a lot more human than the shorthand version most people have heard. Let's start with who was actually on that plane, because it matters. This wasn't a random group of strangers. Most of the passengers were members of a rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay, called the Old Christians Club, along with their friends and family. They had chartered a plane to fly to Santiago, Chile for a match. Young men, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, along with a handful of parents and relatives who came along for the trip. The aircraft was a twin-engine Fairchild FH227D, flown by the Uruguayan Air Force. To cross the Andes mountain range, the pilots had to navigate a narrow corridor between towering peaks, using a route that required precise timing and clear weather. On October 13th, flying through clouds and turbulence, the pilots misjudged their position. They believed they had already cleared the mountain range. They hadn't. The plane clipped a peak, tore off both wings and the tail section, and the fuselage, essentially the main body of the plane, slid down a steep snow-covered slope like a toboggan before finally coming to a stop. It happened in seconds. Several passengers were thrown from the wreckage or killed instantly on impact. Others died from their injuries in the hours and days that followed. When the survivors took stock, they found themselves stranded at roughly 11,700 feet above sea level in the middle of the Andes, with no way to know exactly where they were. Many had no protection against the type of cold you'd need serious mountaineering gear to survive. Here's the detail that made their situation so much worse. Search planes did fly over the area in the days after the crash, but the wreckage of the plane, which was mostly white, blended almost perfectly into the snow below. Search crews flying overhead never spotted it. After 8 days of searching without success, the search was officially called off. The survivors actually heard a radio broadcast confirming this on a small transistor radio one of them had managed to get working. They learned in real time that the world believed they were already dead. Think about what that does to a group of people already fighting to survive. There was no rescue coming. Whatever happened next was entirely up to them. By this point, the group had organized themselves out of necessity. They rationed what little food had survived the crash, small amounts of chocolate, crackers, some wine, but it ran out within about a week. They melted snow for water using pieces of metal from the wreckage, angled to catch sunlight. They used seat cushions and insulation from the plane for warmth. At night, temperatures inside the fuselage, their only shelter, still dropped far below freezing. And then came the decision that would define this story for the rest of history. With no food left and no rescue in sight, the survivors made the decision to eat the flesh of those who had already died in the crash. It's important to understand how they actually approached this, because the reality is far less sensational and far more considered than how it's often portrayed. Several of the survivors were medical students. They understood, even in a moment of crisis, that their bodies would eventually break down from starvation regardless of willpower, and that the human body could not survive on snow and chocolate alone for months in extreme cold at high altitude. Group discussions about the decision reportedly went on for days. Many of the survivors have described it since as one of the most difficult ethical and emotional decisions any of them ever had to make. Some describing it in later interviews as an act of communion, drawing a direct comparison to their Catholic faith and the idea of one body sustaining others. This wasn't a decision made lightly, and it wasn't hidden or covered up once the survivors were eventually found. They spoke about it openly, understanding it would be controversial because they believed the truth mattered more than how it might be perceived. 16 days after the crash, on October 29th, disaster struck again. An avalanche swept down the mountain and buried the fuselage while most of the survivors were sleeping inside it. 8 more people died, suffocated under the snow before anyone could dig them out. The survivors who lived through it spent the following days trapped inside the buried wreckage, digging themselves a small breathing space while a fresh blizzard raged outside for several more days. By this point, of the original 45 people who boarded the plane, only 27 remained alive, and they were running out of time. As weeks passed, it became clear that no one was coming to save them. If they were going to survive, they would have to save themselves. This led to one of the most physically extraordinary parts of the entire story. Two of the survivors, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, volunteered to attempt something that sounds almost impossible. They would climb out of the crash site over the surrounding mountains and walk until they found help, all without proper climbing equipment, in freezing temperatures, at extreme altitude, while severely malnourished. On December 12th, nearly 2 months after the crash, Parrado and Canessa set out. They had no map that accurately represented the terrain, no compass, no technical climbing gear. What they did have was a sleeping bag they'd stitched together from airplane insulation and food they'd carefully saved for the journey. They climbed a peak that, once they reached the top, revealed something devastating. Based on the maps they had, they believed they were close to the Chilean border and civilization. Instead, from the summit, all they could see in every direction was more mountains. They had, without knowing it, actually crashed much further into the heart of the Andes than anyone realized, closer to the Argentine side than the Chilean side they'd been aiming for. They kept going anyway. For 10 days, Parrado and Canessa hiked and climbed through the Andes, descending in elevation, hoping to eventually reach a valley, a road, anything. They covered roughly 38 miles of brutal terrain on foot, an extraordinary physical feat even for trained mountaineers with proper equipment, let alone two young men surviving on almost nothing. On December 20th, 1972, they finally spotted something that changed everything. A man on horseback, on the other side of a river, along with cattle grazing nearby, unmistakable signs of civilization. The man was a Chilean shepherd named Sergio Catalan. Unable to cross the rushing river between them, Parrado reportedly wrote a note, wrapped it around a rock, and threw it across. The note explained in simple terms who they were, and that people were still alive and stranded in the mountains. Catalan rode for hours to reach the nearest town and alert authorities. Word reached Chilean and Uruguayan officials, and a rescue operation was immediately organized. On December 22nd and 23rd, 1972, helicopters located the crash site and airlifted the remaining survivors out, more than 2 months after the plane had gone down. In total, 16 of the original 45 people on board Flight 571 survived. 16 people who endured a plane crash, an avalanche, starvation, extreme cold, and finally an unassisted trek across one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges on the planet. When the survivors returned home, their story became international news almost overnight, and the details about how they survived, specifically the choice to eat the flesh of those who had died, became a global controversy. Some condemned it, many others, once they understood the full context, the medical reasoning, the group discussions, the framing many of the survivors themselves gave it, came to see it not as a horror story, but as one of the most extraordinary examples of human survival instinct combined with genuine moral reasoning under unimaginable pressure. The story has since been told in the best-selling book Alive, a 1993 Hollywood film of the same name, and more recently the critically acclaimed 2023 film Society of the Snow, which was based directly on survivor accounts and nominated for major international awards. What stands out most, even decades later, isn't just that they survived. It's how they survived together, making impossible decisions as a group, refusing to give up even after being told by the entire world that they were already dead. 16 people walked, or were carried, off that mountain in December of 1972. Every single one of them had a story about exactly how far the human body and the human will can actually go when there's simply no other choice.